Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to History Valley Podcast, where we have debate night. Tonight's debate between Jacob Berman and Kevin Maxwell. Did Jesus exist? Did Jesus exist? Kevin is going to be taking the negative, wherein tonight Jacob will be taking the affirmative. Did Jesus exist between Jacob Berman and Kevin Maxwell? I would like to thank everybody for supporting the channel. And without any further ado, Kevin, do you want to begin your opening arguments for tonight?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me, first of all. And I'll just jump right into the presentation, and then I'll probably explain a few more points that aren't in the presentation that I'd like to make. So we can bring that up.
Okay.
So this is just something I threw together today just to kind of keep on track. I didn't put a lot of work into the slide for a few reasons, but basically my position is there's no historical Jesus, and that's based on how I interpret the evidence. And so basically the historical argumentation I was just summarizing from what I heard from Jacob. So the gospel was written in the 1830s, in the earliest texts mentioning Jesus. So the Gospel of Hebrews and Thomas, and then the New Testament books post Josephus and Clement of Rome. So these are the points I'm kind of rebutting, but the main one I want to rebut is that basically it's kind of the misguided idea that the crucifixion is a common form of execution. Not that it wasn't common, but that it was only specific to like the Romans, and that there's no like symbolism behind it, and there's no parallel in ancient mythology or astrotheology, because I think that's just kind of a misguided concept, basically. And maybe it's kind of irrelevant. So basically, it is interesting to understand the historical timeline. I think that's what we're trying to do here. Is our goal is to understand, okay, this happened and this happened and this happened, and then we can explain, okay, there was a historical Jesus or there wasn't, and we're kind of explaining that through this historical story or timeline. And although there's persuasive evidence concerning this Pontius Pilate's existence, I still think it's convincing that the Gospels use political leaders in their astrotheological texts in order to historicize the religion, making it like high definition in order to understand divinity and humanity even further. And I think that kind of along the progress of history, by the 2nd and 3rd centuries, this becomes Christianity. And they're just trying to they're saying that the ones that are more historical were more accurate, but they're just taking the evidence and they're picking and choosing which Gospels they like. And then, as Cicero's philosophy states, so far as it might be answered, Pilate's question, what is truth, or to teach men, as Cicero described it, the knowledge of things human and divine, is to teach men knowledge of things human and divine. So their goal here is to teach, basically understand divinity, and so that's the purpose to me of the text, the evidence, so to speak, of historical Pilate or Jesus. Since we're kind of using Pilate as like this, seems to be lots of evidence for historical Pilate. Therefore, there must be this historical Jesus, and that's kind of what I'm hearing as the historical argument. But to me, it's kind of an astrological joke, because Pilate asks the question of what is truth, and he's speaking to this guy Jesus who says, "I am the truth." So it's kind of this joke that Pilate's this historical person that they're using to say this is the true history, because he's the guy who is famously asked what is truth, right? And I believe he takes a symbolic role as well. The narrative around Pilate to me is symbolic. Therefore, like it leads to the questions of basically what is the true history of Pilate? So what was his life really like? And just on a basic level, how did he actually interact with this person named Jesus? And where's the evidence for that? So if the evidence for Pilate then is squarely rooted in the Gospels, to me that's no evidence at all for a historically true account of what Pilate did or Jesus either. Obviously, I would have to demonstrate that this story is astromythology, and I believe I can do that. But number two is there may be no 100% parallel to a crucifixion that happened, but it didn't develop in a vacuum. In one sense, there's nothing that is 100% parallel in anything without becoming like a copyright issue. It just, like, to me, if you copy anything 100%, it's just the same story. We can still understand the logical progression, though, of the symbolism on the zodiac, especially in the context of the feastal Passover. So the context of a crucifixion in the New Testament happens on a Passover, and it happens according to a timeline that follows the zodiac on the spring equinox. And to me, that's astrotheological. So it's kind of bizarre to say that the crucifixion isn't there's no parallel in astrotheology when it itself is astrotheology in its very nature. And the cross itself, to me, that's the four cardinal directions. And then all of a sudden you have a cross, and you have basically a personified sun god on this cross. So to me, it's just 100% astrotheological. So you can't say it's not. It doesn't have any parallel in astrotheology. It seems in Romans, the Romans got their crucifixion idea from the Persians and Babylonians. Of course, the Babylonians probably had it before the Persians, and then that's also where you get Zoroastrianism, Mithraism, and the Magi's. And then the Persians were crucifying because the earth was sacred, and they want to keep the corrupt body, the corpse, off the earth. And then this was part of their religious practice. And to me, again, there's no really big difference to these ancient people between the astrotheology and the sacred and their religion. So it becomes like a temple practice or an illegal practice at the same time. And so they keep the body off the sacred ground. Astrotheology contained these sacred principles as well. So then some outstanding questions I have is, I was looking into this crucifixion as well in other areas of history, and Alexander the Great. There seems to be an account of him crucifying 2,000 males on the border between the sea and the land as a symbolic warning. And my question is, could this be an astrotheological metaphor like the Passover lamb, where there's 2,000 males or the 2,000 visible stars or something like that, or sparks of consciousness on the border between the sky or the sea and the land, or it's the earth? And then they hung on the cross, which is like the four cardinal directions, or whatever, however you want to interpret the cross. To me, it's a symbolic story. There's not a lot of archaeological evidence of these thousands of crucifixions. Like, there seems to be rare evidence archaeologically of crucifixions. And then if not, why not? And why not what, men and women? It just seems like he crucified men, and then all of a sudden these women and children are taken as slaves. And to me, that could be some symbolism there too. Like, why did they differentiate and say, okay, you go here? They stand them all up in a line and say, you go here, you go there. To me, it just doesn't really make sense logically to treat entire groups of people as like an individual, or male or female, kind of like the Gospels do. Numbers were the language of the gods, so we have to keep that in mind. So you have to like interpret through the force of the metaphor. Why did Pilate symbolically release Barabbas? And Barabbas means basically the son of the father. And then this becomes like a trade-off, a swap. To me, it's a symbolic swap. And it shows the symbolism of the person of Pilate in the Gospels as well. So then it makes me question the historicity of that story itself. And then what is the true story? Again, it just leaves me wondering what the true story is of Pilate, and what did he actually do? And so that's basically my argumentation. And there's a second part to this, which I didn't have in this slide show, which is the idea of human psychology and how we understanding history. And I believe we have to, when we study ancient religious texts, we have to study our own human psychology alongside understanding, studying the text, because there's this thing called the rationalist delusion. And and there's a book called by Jonathan Haidt, and he talks about why good people are divided by religion and politics, and he talks about the rationalist delusion and how we all think we're rational, but really it's like we're riding an elephant, and the elephant is our emotions and our intuitions, and the rational mind is like the person riding on the elephant. So we like to think we're in control of the elephant, but really the elephant is our subconscious and our emotions, and it kind of guides what we believe about these texts, about history. So to me, we have to actually understand our own minds as well as understanding the texts, so that we don't become overconfident in what we believe about history and these texts. And
Kevin, you're close to 10 minutes. I'm going to give you a little more time. Keep going.
yeah. And then the second piece of that is the evidence for that, again, is in that book, but it's also in the idea that religions are geographical. If your parents are Christians, then you'll probably grow up as a Christian. If your parents are Muslim, you'll probably grow up as a Muslim, and you'll hold certain ideas more sacred than other ideas. So my question is, again, what is the motivation for believing that Jesus is historical? On my journey, when I looked at the timeline and I found out the resurrection was in the past, and that Jesus came a second time and brought salvation in the first century, symbolically to the New Jerusalem, and then that was part of a second Exodus motif, and it was part of a sort of an exodus of the soul on the zodiac. Then I could think more clearly to say, okay, this is a symbolic story where it's trying to explore the symbolism of the salvation of the soul and understand divinity of God and the universe and the nature of the universe, and the justification of evil and all that. So what is our motivation for believing in a historical Jesus? So I'll just leave you with that question.
Okay. Stop. Jacob, are you ready for your opening arguments?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
So did Jesus exist? Episode 2. Why I put episode 2 in the subtitles, because I debated Kevin Maxwell before about 2 years ago. And what I'm going to be going through is what I think is evidence for a historical Jesus. Now, a lot of people that watch me know that I don't argue for a historical Jesus, often in the same way that other historicists do, but I do agree with the consensus that there was a historical Jesus. And I understand that just because a lot of scholars and a lot of lay people think that Jesus existed, it's not necessarily evidence on its own that Jesus existed. For it is taught in college and elsewhere that argument from authority and argument from majority are both fallacies. I understand all that. But I am convinced, because I think there's good reason that Jesus existed, not because a lot of people happen to believe that he existed. That being said, I'm going to quote from Bart Ehrman, and he says, the Jesus proclaimed by preachers and theologians today had no existence. That particular Jesus is, or those particular Jesuses are, a myth, but there was a historical Jesus who was very much a man of his time, and we can know what he was like. Schweitzer's view of the historical Jesus happens to be mine as well, at least in rough outline. I agree with Schweitzer and virtually all scholars in the field since his day that Jesus existed, that he was a electably Jewish, that there is historical information about him in the Gospels, and that we can therefore know some things about what he said and did. Moreover, I agree with Schweitzer's overarching view that Jesus is best understood as a Jewish prophet who anticipated a cataclysmic break in history in the very near future, when God would destroy the forces of evil to bring in his own kingdom here on earth. Before I continue, that reminds me of Jesus ben Ananus. I don't have a slide covering that part right now, but Jesus ben Ananus is a character mentioned by Josephus, who, very much like Jesus Barabbas and Barabbas in Kevin Maxwell's introductory argument, he mentioned Barabbas. Jesus ben Ananus was brought before Governor Albinus in the Wars of the Jews. And then it was decided that he would be released. They concluded that Jesus ben Ananus was a lunatic, and that Jesus ben Ananus thought that the temple would be soon destroyed. He was preaching, woe to Jerusalem, over and over again. Just kind of like the historical Jesus was supposed to have done. Now, the little apocalypse, which is in Mark 13, and Matthew and Luke are deriving the little apocalypse from Mark 13, postulates that Jesus knew about the temple being destroyed in advance. Now, there is no evidence that the little apocalypse predates 70 AD. It looks like it was put into Jesus' mouth. Kevin correctly noted that I do believe that the New Testament text knows Josephus. I do think the 4 Gospels and the 13-letter collection attributed to Paul, with the majority of those letters attributed to co-authors that were working with Paul and collaborating with Paul, or the person claiming to be Paul is the way I should put it, because I actually argue that Saul of Scholar wrote those letters. But this is not a debate about Paul. I'm not going to get into much about the details about the formation of Paul, because that's a very complicated subject for another time. If you want to know about my position on that fully, watch the other videos that I've done on that topic. Well, let's keep going. Best sources for historical Jesus. I had to pick 5 sources that I think are the best sources for historical Jesus. Logia Jesu by Thomas, Sayings of Jesus, which later becomes the Gospel of Thomas when it's redacted and expanded by a Manichaean claiming to be Thomas, a follower of Mani in the 3rd century AD. We are told about this by Cyril of Jerusalem in the 4th century, about a different version of the Gospel of Thomas that was produced by a Manichaean. Now, I know it has to be a different version, regardless of what anybody says about the Gospel of Thomas, because we have much earlier citations of the Gospel of Thomas from like Origen of Alexandria, especially Hippolytus, and more especially so Papias and Clement of Rome. In the Clementine recognitions, the Gospel of Thomas is mentioned. In no way am I claiming that the full-scale Coptic Thomas, which dates to the 3rd century AD, should be dated before the Gospels. That's not what I said. I said that a much smaller version of Thomas was probably written in the AD 30s by Jesus' brother, or actually who I think was his half-brother, because the twin thing comes in later. I will note that the Oxyrhynchus fragments of Thomas never refer to Thomas as twin. That's only in the Coptic version. Clement of Rome never mentions that Thomas was the twin either. Neither does Papias of Hierapolis. And Papias, he helped John write the Gospel of John in about or around AD 135, and he never mentions the twin, even though Thomas is called the twin in the Gospel of John. Oddly enough, even though he helped John compose the Gospel of John. Anyway, then you got the genuine Clementine writings, Josephus and Tacitus. So I think that Thomas, the Hebrew Gospel, the genuine Clementine writings, Josephus and Tacitus are 5 of the best sources for historical Jesus. So dating the sources. So here I talk about Thomas primarily, but I'm also going to mention some other stuff I don't have typed on this slide. That I think that the original Thomas was written about 32 AD. I think the Gospel of the Hebrews is about 36 AD. And I think that everything else that is the 27 books of the New Testament post-date the year AD 90. I think that the Pauline epistles, which predate the rest of the New Testament, were written in the mid to late AD 90s. And I think that the 4 Gospels were written in the 2nd century. This takes me to the Paul problem. Like I said earlier, in this debate, I will not be utilizing Paul's epistles as evidence for historical Jesus, at least not in the traditional way other historicists do, because there is a problem involving the formation of Paul's epistles. Attestation. Clement mentions only a letter by Paul and knows nothing of the 13 epistles commonly attributed to Paul and his co-authors, indicating that the canonical epistles post-date the genuine Clementine writings, and thus were written in the mid to late AD 90s, not in the AD 30s, 40s, or 50s. And there is a movement right now of scholars that are postulating the new Pauline chronology, as I like to call it, just that are moving the letters of Paul in a later time period. To simplify things, I will use Clement's writings when referring to Paul without utilizing canonical Paul as primary evidence of the historical Paul's encounter with James, the brother of Jesus. James succeeds Jesus. In saying 12, I put Clementine reconstruction there because Clement attests to this. James succeeds Jesus. Disciples said to Jesus, "We know you're going to leave us. who will lead us then? Jesus said to them, wherever you are, you'll go to James the Just, for whom heaven and earth came into being, as in saying 12, and Thomas. And the Gospel of the Hebrews, which I think comes after Thomas, the Gospel of the Hebrews says that Jesus supposedly appeared to James. Now, this is an embellishment because Thomas never claims that a post-risen Jesus appeared to James. In fact, there is no discussion of the resurrection or even the crucifixion in Thomas at all, but an expectation that Jesus was going to die very soon here. And that's why the followers Jesus asked him, his disciples asked him, who will take your place? And he said, James. Look to James, he said. But here we get a different story where Jesus appears to James. James refuses to eat and drink. He's fasting until Jesus appears to him, according to the Hebrew gospel. Again, none of these miracle stories appear in Thomas. That's why the Gospel of John is responding to Thomas. Elaine Pagels argues that the Gospel of John knows Thomas. For not all the same reasons that I do, but I agree with her to the extent that I think that John knew a version of Thomas, the Thomas that I'm talking about. It's just a much smaller, shorter text. It's nowhere near the size of our Coptic version. Let's talk about the Mara bar Serapon letter. The Mara bar Serapon letter is often dated around the year 73 AD by many scholars. Here, this particular scholar is noting independent cooperation of Jewish participation is also involved by the letter of Mara bar Serapon dated by J. Blenzler in the period around 73 AD. And furthermore, it is entirely proper to ask how Paul could write 1 Thessalonians 2:15 if Jesus was condemned simply by Roman sentence and execution. Let me note here that Dr. Catchpole is quite correct in noting that because Josephus in the Testimonium blames both Jewish and Roman authorities for Jesus' death. So this is actually consistent with the Testimonium in Josephus. So no surprise to me, because I think 1 Thessalonians is, well, aware of this letter and Josephus anyway. Let's take a look at the exact thing that Mara bar Serapion actually says.
Jacob, you're at 10 minutes. Just give it a little more time and wrap it up. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll have to finish my presentation in my second response then. In my first response, excuse me. So I'll wrap it up by saying, what advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. So he's linking that the abolishment of the kingdom is connected to this king that many scholars interpret as being Jesus. Notice that Mara bar Serapion compares the person to Pythagoras, Socrates. So I'll stop there. I'll save the rest of it for my first response about evidence of crucifixion and James, the brother of Jesus.
Okay. All right, let's get us through the opening arguments. Kevin, you ready to start your first round? They're 10-minute rounds, and like I said, I'm a little flexible with the time. I'll try to give you guys a 1-minute warning. And want you to finish your thoughts though when you get to the 10-minute mark. It's okay to go a little over. You going to be using PowerPoint, Kevin? You're muted, Kevin. Here we go.
Yeah.
Are you going to be using PowerPoint or no?
No. I mean, I have some more notes here. I'll just talk from my notes. So basically.
Okay, let me get myself set up here. Whenever you're ready, Kevin.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Whenever you're ready to start, you can go ahead and start.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think that's interesting. I'm not super familiar with some of these texts, but when I read, for example, the Gospel of Thomas, or similar to the sayings of Jesus, again, I read symbolic letters, and they're exploring the symbolic Christ. And to me, this, again, it centers around the symbolism of the zodiac, and the timing of everything that Jesus does always goes back to what the sun is doing and the seasons are doing, and they're showing us they're basically showing us the hidden meaning. And again, they're trying to understand divinity, and they're trying to understand the purpose of life. So when I think about like the ancient Roman or Greek like history, I kind of compare it to the Egyptian histories, like Herodotus. He talks about, well, these are the different accounts of what the Egyptians said about their history, and these people said about their history. And so I trust Herodotus more because he's comparing and he's reasoning through it. But when I see a text like the Gospel of Thomas or any of the Gospels, to me it's more like a book of Revelation, where it's telling a parable story, and it's giving an account of basically a sun myth or astrotheology cycle. And if that's true, then then what do we actually know about the historical Jesus? And even this idea of James, the brother of Christ, is for sure based on the zodiac, because when the sailors would look up at the sky, sailing was very common in the ancient Near East, and they would use astronomy and astrology to give themselves directions and orient themselves. And when it was when they see the brothers twins in Gemini, of course you have the twins. They say it's the brothers are out, or something along those lines. And you have, what do you have there? You have Orion is like one of the most obvious constellations in the sky, and then he ends up becoming like a symbol for like Osiris, and and you have Orion is like basically an offshoot from Taurus, which is right near Gemini. So you have the twins, you have Orion, and Orion actually kind of looks like his arms up, like he's hanging on a cross. So then you have the twins, and in ancient mythology, of course, you have the one twin which goes to heaven is a salvation, and the other twin is basically goes to hell. Or you have Horus and Set, and the one is the good sun god, one's the bad sun god, and it's the spring season and the fall season. So this is where you get, to me, this is Jesus is basically the savior in the center, and he's mediating between heaven and earth, and he's the sun god who's showing us the way or the truth and the life of God. And if we can find out what that is, you begin to to me, the goal of that is to understand yourself, spirituality, and why we're here. And so to me, Jesus minimizes the historicity of it. And that's, so I look to Jesus as a symbol for spiritual practice. And that's how the Bible is used. That's how all these texts are being used. So how is the text used? It's used as a spiritual text. It's not used as a historical text. It's only used as a historical text for in some like universities nowadays, because it fits in with the Western cultural Christianity, and we're brought up with those values. So then you have to go and you have to reevaluate your values and how you even understand history in terms of like, so it's hard to basically tell people how they're supposed to understand ancient history in a short 10-minute presentation. But to me, you become familiar with the zodiac, and you'll see, okay, Jesus is this amazing symbol. So then, to me, it becomes almost irrelevant. But to say, oh, well, James was the brother of Jesus, and he knew Jesus, and this other guy knew it too. Well, that, to me, that's just a problem of, okay, which order did these texts come out in, and then who copied who? To me, that's not really evidence of a historical Jesus. That's evidence of like a relationship that's been personified on the zodiac. So you have to literally go to the zodiac. You have to draw out the pictures, and you have to see, okay, this is the symbol of the brothers. Okay, here's the two brothers. It's Gemini, and these brothers basically they do this, and this is part of that story. And then you put together the narrative, and you say, okay, this is not history. This is basically a mythology that's based on like a geocentric model of the universe. So it's not even based on like a current science in that sense. It's based on old science and an old understanding, ancient understanding of the universe. And they're personifying these elements and creating a history with it. Now, that's not to say that there is no historical people, or they don't there's not actual people who wrote this and didn't give account for it. But when you see a text that's has this symbolism and these flags, to me there's like red flags. Okay, this is a symbol. To me, you have to wrap your head around the symbolism of it, and then you can start to recognize, okay, this is symbolic. Divinity was often associated with these astrotheological characters. Royalty, for example, in ancient Egypt, the royalty was named after the gods of Egypt because they were associated to be more divine, whereas the peasants had different names because they weren't as divine. So then when the Romans come along, well, they drop that bar a little bit to basically political leaders, and then political leaders get kind of enrolled, and then it becomes more high definition, becomes more realistic. That this Jesus was a historical person, that this prophet or sun god was a historical person, and so that's my perspective basically. And yeah, maybe I can stop there. I don't know if I'm running out of time.
No, you're at 6 minutes and 45 seconds. You have a little bit of time.
Yeah. So then even the evidence, I think, like let me just find this here. When I was just trying to find it was the Clementine. There's the evidence of the stories of Peter, and Jacob was getting his evidence from that. And I was just trying to the Clement of Rome. So it's of the Gospel of Thomas. Yeah, he was getting it from Clementine. So I was basically saying a man named Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Of course, the priests are using a famous historical political leader in their fake history in order to persuade the masses of their astrotheology. All these texts are symbolic. There is nothing we know about Jesus that is not what the Son does. Timing determines the nature of the crucifixion. So to me, you have to understand the timeline, the astrotheological timeline, and that timeline is the 7 feasts. You have to look at the 10 commandments. You look at, okay, how did the Jews understand these feasts? And then they kind of copy the archetype in the New Testament. So Jesus is the savior, or the ultimate sacrifice. He's the ultimate symbol of crucifixion. So he becomes the perfect sacrifice, and to me that is the symbol. It's an archetype by itself. It becomes a perfect sacrifice. His mom sacrifices her son. He has a virgin birth, which is astrotheological. The man dying under Pontius Pilate was not any Jesus we know of. The narrative of a man named Jesus, which turned into legend, to me is less plausible than a son being personified and turning into legend, because the evidence suggests he is the Son. And basically, we have the other point is that we have all these different Gospels. So to me, the evidence, why do we have a bunch of different Gospels in the first place? They weren't included in the New Testament, but we know of them from fragments or references by church fathers. So there's the Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Judas, etc., etc. And there are more. So to me, why is there so many different Gospels? To me, they weren't trying to create a true history. They were trying
30 seconds.
Yeah, they were trying to explore divinity through symbolism. And they were doing that by creating more and more Gospels to achieve some goal of understanding and wisdom. So these are artistic works, and they had artistic license. And that's my argument.
Okay. All right. Jacob, would you like to begin your rebuttal, if you will, of his argument?
I'm going to put my presentation back on full screen.
Okay.
Let me put things in our way, even if one disagrees with the dating of the text as I've outlined it earlier. What I'm trying to show this an awareness that Jesus had a person succeed him named James. Whether James was actually his brother or not is not as relevant to the fact that James actually succeeds Jesus, according to various texts. And then later on, we get this idea that Peter is the actual successor instead, and James' authority kind of gets kicked to the curb. Now here, I want to get to my rebuttal of the astrotheological arguments, or astronogenesis, as I like to call it, the idea that the Jesus character originates from astronomy. Here, notice that the Clement refers to James as the chief of the bishops, and this is under Gamaliel and Caiaphas. The only time that those two held their respective positions of power, because Gamaliel was the Nasi. Nasi is Hebrew for president of the Sanhedrin, and Caiaphas was the high priest. The only time that they both held those respective positions was from the year 30 to 36 AD. That's when Saul attacks James. Now, in the recognitions, Paul is only mentioned one time as Saul, and that is it. The name Paul never occurred, nor Saul ever occurs again in the entire Clementine recognitions. In fact, in the recognitions, Saul is ever called Paul. Saul is the negative mode of the character Paul when he's a persecutor. The way Clement thinks about it is he's not, the character doesn't change his name from Saul to Paul like in Acts. Because in Acts, even though it tries to portray as interchangeable, Saul becomes Paul in Acts, not necessarily in the Clementine literature, in the genuine Clementine literature. One Clement, when Paul is a good person, he's called Paul. When he's a persecutor trying to kill James, he's called Saul. And this happened no later than 36 AD. I think it's happening around 36 AD. This creates a problem about identifying this James with the James in Josephus. Here, James is called the Lord's brother. See my mouse right here. I'm going to show you that just real fast. We're going to move on. And here, Clement tells us in book 9 of the recognitions about the Gospel of Thomas. And here he notes that Thomas is criticizing Persian sexual practices, because he's criticizing them for engaging in incestuous behavior. This is not in our Gospel of Thomas. He's actually quoting an older version of Thomas here, because none of this is in our version of Thomas. This was removed from Thomas. That's my point. The Thomas that Clement and Papias and Hippolytus knew, it's not the same Thomas that Origen knew. It's not the same Thomas that the Manichaean Thomas created in the 230s to 240s AD, somewhere around there. That's a later creation. This is not the same Thomas that I'm talking about. It is similar, but it's not the same text. Papias, writing in the 130s AD, like I've mentioned earlier. Just to be clear, I think the four Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, are written from around 100 to 135 AD. I put the four Gospels in that range. With the earlier version of Mark being a preaching of Peter, the first iteration of what later becomes Mark, the preaching of Peter was written in, I think, late 80s, 90s, after the creation of canonical Paul. But anyway, Papias says here that he knows about sayings. I highlighted it down here in teal. What Andrew or Peter said, or what was said by Philip or by Thomas. Now, how do you know about sayings of Thomas? And then he talks about Matthew. What is he talking about there? And elsewhere, we're told about the Gospel of the Hebrews by Papias. He says that Matthew wrote in the Hebrew tongue. I don't have that on the screen right now, but Papias does say this in the fragments. Pseudo-Dorotheus attire, so-called Pseudo-Dorotheus attire, does confirm that James was killed nearly immediately after he was discovered to be alive by another person. We're not told who that person was. Arm of a Fuller's Club that brained him, knocked him upon the head and brained him. You can see that right here. Fuller's Club knocked him upon the head and brained him. Now, this comes from Dr. George Shellington, where he talks about that Paul can thus refer to the filial relationship of James with Jesus as brother of the Lord, and his readers will know who the Lord is. Neither would Paul consider instruction from James equal in authority to the Spirit of the Lord. Obviously not, since, well, Paul tried to kill James. We see from the Clementine literature that Paul, the original historical Paul, was not interested in arguing with James at all. Galatians is a very different portrays things very differently from how it actually happened. Paul tried to kill James, in my opinion. Josephus mentions Jesus in the Testimony of Flavianum. I accept this entire passage as genuine. Dr. Samuel Zenner accepts this passage as entirely genuine. Dr. Gary Goldberg, both of whom I've had on my channel before, believe that this entire passage is genuine as it is. I agree with that position. I admit this is not a position that that scholars typically hold. I'm siding with the scholars that are more radical in the sense that I think this whole thing is genuine. I don't have a problem with it as it is written. I don't think it literally means that Josephus was a Christian. Tacitus, in the early 2nd century, he's telling us about the crucifixion of Christus under Pontius Pilate, links Christus to violent people, said that Emperor Nero fastened the guilt of the fire of Rome upon them too. I doubt the testimonium was an interpolation. I don't buy that at all. I especially don't buy that this is an interpolation, because I don't see why anybody, any Christian, would have wanted to write this in here. Now, I'm not saying that my opponent in this debate holds the position that these are interpolations. In fact, from the first debate, and Kevin, you can correct me if I'm wrong in your response, but I think you were saying that you're fine with the testimonium at least being authentic. I don't know what your view is on Tacitus, but I guess I'll find out shortly. Okay, finally, the astrotheology claims, or astronogenesis, as I like to call it. The astrotheological origin of Jesus, which my opponent holds to, is the claim that Jesus was based on astrology. This is connected primarily to the claim that Jesus is based upon Sol, our system's sun, and that Jesus Christ is in fact based upon sun worship. There are several problems, I think, with these claims. To start off, when Josephus refers to Jesus, he never claims that Jesus was based upon the sun, nor did he suggest that Jesus was the light of the world, which comes into play in the Gospel of John 8:12. The Gospel of John is the 4th Gospel, and it knows Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And lately, much more scholars have been coming to the conclusion that that is the case. I mentioned earlier that Dr. Elaine Pagels thinks that John knows the Gospel of Thomas in her book Beyond Belief, just to remind everybody real quick. Walking on water. The astrological claim, the astrological origin adherents also claim that Jesus walking on water is the sun reflecting on water. The claim is refuted by several facts, both the OG Thomas and even the Coptic version, even though the latter knows our 4 canonical Gospels, is missing the story of Jesus walking on water. Not to mention that both versions of Thomas is missing every miracle of Jesus pretty much from our Gospels. That's why John was so critical of the original Thomas, trying to rehabilitate Thomas and say, oh, you were a doubting Thomas. Oh, I get it. I'm going to say that Thomas was convinced later. He got convinced later that Jesus is the real deal. That's because John was trying to get around a real big problem. Now, the Gospel of Hebrews, which was written before all the New Testament books and after the original Thomas, is also missing this theme. And as I mentioned, even Luke, which knows Mark and Matthew, doesn't have it either. In 2nd Maccabees, which is a 2nd century BCE text, in chapter 5, 21, chapter 5, verse 21 says, so when Antiochus had taken away out of the temple 1,800 talents, he went back in all haste to Antioch, thinking through pride that he might now make the land navigable and the sea passable on foot. Such was the hauntedness of his mind.
30 seconds.
Okay. Well, just to finish up, the parallels here, I think, have been noted before about Jesus walking on water to that scene in 2nd Maccabees. So we have, not in any miraculous way, of course, but we have events in real life that can be similar to what's going on in the obviously exaggerated situation of the walking on water scene in Mark, Matthew, and John. Am I to believe that Antiochus never existed because he had a very similar scenario? Obviously not. And just to close, we got the 12 disciples. In my next response, I'm going to mention the 12 disciples and why I think that it does not have it does not have to do with the zodiac, at least in the way that my opponent claims. I rest my case for now.
Okay.
Yeah, to me, Josephus basically says, if he be a man. So Josephus doesn't really even know if what he's saying is true necessarily. Like, unless he said, I saw him, and it's like, okay, what did you actually see? So it's so hard to actually know some of this stuff. But so yeah, when it comes to Tacitus, like I have to look at it again. But I don't know if like the text itself might be authentic, but then where did he get that text? And like, where did Josephus get his history from? And then was he just collecting that from more astrotheology texts? So, and to me, it's not just about the walking on water. You can look at anything Jesus does. He spends 40 days in the wilderness. 40 is a symbolic number. To me, that's basically symbolizing either the cycle of the 4 seasons, or it's symbolizing the 40 days until the first harvest of Pentecost. And of course, Jesus spends 40 days again after his crucifixion until Pentecost in the book of Acts. Maybe Acts you don't think is historical either. And then, of course, Jesus comes, and what does he preach? He preaches the kingdom of the heavens, and he has 12 disciples. And then of course, all these disciples are called his brothers and sisters. And then it's like, okay, why does he have one brother? And then his brothers are the sons of thunder. And it references this Boanerges, the sons of thunder are the brothers in Greek mythology. And so you have something that parallels whatever there. And Jesus, he fulfills the law and the prophets. So he's basically copying Exodus, and he's taking people through a wilderness, and that's until his second coming. And that's what the entire New Testament letters are kind of in the setting of. They're carrying the church or the body of Christ, and then the symbolism of the body as the church, and the symbolism of the body as the Atman or the atom, the body of Nut and Geb, an Egyptian mythology, or the Jewish Kabbalism, where basically the atom is the sun god, and it's the body of the universe, and it's the body of Christ, and the sun goes through the body of Christ, right? And we get baptized through this earthly existence, and so the baptism is astrotheological. We get baptized in the winter season every year. We get baptized in the night cycle every day. So to me, there's like everything about it is astrotheology, unless you're going to say that they didn't use a calendar. But am I saying that there's no historical Jesus? Well, like, how do you know what Jesus did then? If everything he does is follows to the day, the Jewish feasts, and he does everything miraculously according to these feasts. And to me, it's just much more reasonable to think, okay, this is symbolic. And so then, like, it's almost like, who cares who the real Jesus was, because I don't know anything about him to begin with, and he obviously isn't going to save me and give me salvation from anything. So it's like the whole debate kind of just gets boring after that. but so that, to me, that's why are people debating Christianity in the first place? Well, it's because it's the story of the greatest possible sacrifice for the greatest possible reward, and psychologically that's an inspirational story. And so then whether or not Josephus had an authentic text becomes irrelevant, maybe. And to me, Josephus fulfills he describes the destruction of Jerusalem, and he's talking symbolically too. Like, he says that basically a cow gives birth to a lamb, and so obviously that's not talking historically, literally, but he's speaking symbolically of the age of Taurus moving into the age of the lamb. and then you see the Lamb of God dying. That's representing the end of that age. So the death of the animals is how they looked at the calendar. That's how they understood these ages and their epochs, and they have different layers of ages and different sizes of ages. And the smaller the age, the more relevant to the flesh and the human spirit and the individual. And the larger the age, the more spiritual this age is. And so there's so much going on with some of these texts that it takes a lot of time to kind of parse out, like, who was whose brother, and am I saying that there was no Alexander the Great and Dionysus? Well, I'm not saying there was none of them, but I'm just saying the story about them is symbolic, and we can understand the symbolism. If you look deeper at just common sense ancient symbolism, you can understand, okay, this is unlikely to have happened historically, and it's hard to establish what happened historically, and that's why we have these conversations. But to me, at some point, you have to you kind of choose what you want to base your life on, and is it going to be based on something purely symbolic and inspirational, or should I just start debating whether Superman existed or not? And so I think that's where a lot of astrotheologians move on, and maybe there's not a lot of astrotheologists around, because if they actually shared what they believed, it ends up giving people a heart attack around them. But so that's, to me, that's more an interesting conversation. Is who do I want to become? What kind of person do I want to be in light of this new understanding? And then that gives me motivation to continue studying this stuff or not. So if we find out that there was a man, historical Jesus, like, okay, why is that important again? And we can't dismiss that, because we are emotional creatures, and we make decisions about what is true and not true based on our emotions as well. So that's kind of how I would summarize that. Again, my knowledge kind of ends as to some of the legitimacy of this stuff, and trying to explain all of this stuff, to me, comes from sort of the same emotional place. It's like, why do we have to always explain what we believe to everybody? And maybe that's coming from the same rooted subconscious beliefs that there was a historical Jesus, and that we're going to die for not explaining it. And we have to carry out the good news of the gospel. So that's, I don't know, that's more of an emotional sided argument. To me, it's hard to argue with Jacob, because I'm just not quite familiar enough with some of these texts. I've read through, for instance, Josephus and his account, and it's hard to make heads or tails of it for me. But when I read through the destruction of Jerusalem, to me, he is talking about the Gospels in Matthew 24, and he's talking about that the destruction of the temple, which was supposedly prophesied in there, and to me, it fulfills the Jesus's prophecy. So then, why is Josephus motivated to fulfill Jesus's prophecy? And to me, it's pretty obvious that he is part of the influence of the Roman elite, and he's trying to help them establish this religion, and he's trying to be accepted into this religion and promote the history. And of course, he's probably not getting paid anything if he doesn't do that. So what are his motivations? Where did he get this information from, and why is he communicating it to us? So we're all human, and of course, Josephus had these motivations as well. So that's my kind of 2 cents on that. But I'm curious to keep learning from these New Testament scholars and from historians about the existence of this historical Jesus, just to see where it leads, and because maybe I'm wrong, and maybe there was a real man behind the miracles, and then the real man, and then how did it become this symbolic truth that at least seems to be derived from the zodiac symbolism? And then maybe we're even wrong about their entire worldview. And
30 seconds.
And so So to me, it takes the strength to be open-minded enough and to have these debates even without getting too offended and stuff. But so yeah, where do we go from here?
Okay. Yeah, that's your time. You're right at
Yep.
the 10-minute mark.
Yeah.
Okay. Jacob, you're up, Jacob.
So to finish off my presentation, in my final rebuttal, I'm going to talk about the claim that the 12 disciples mentioned in the Gospels are based upon the zodiac. Just give me 1 second. It looks like there was a mistake on that next slide. There. I just fixed it. All right. So the claim that the 12 disciples is based on the zodiac, to me, it's not a necessary claim to make. All one has to do is to go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, look at the community rule 1QS. And the council of the community, there shall be 12 men and 3 priests, perfectly versed in all that is revealed of the law, whose work shall be truth, righteousness, justice, loving kindness, and humility. They shall preserve the faith in the Lord with steadfastness and meekness, and shall atone for sin by the practice of justice and by suffering the sorrows of affliction. They shall walk with all men according to the standard of truth and the rule of time. Now, here's something that I will say. I'll try to meet the astronogenesis position when it comes to this number 12 thing halfway by saying it is interesting that you do happen to have 12 signs of the zodiac, and then you have the obsession with 12. You got 12 men in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the council of the community. We're looking at it right here. And we have 12 guys, 12 disciples of Jesus. Rather, the zodiac may have influenced them into thinking of the number 12 in that particular circumstance, I suppose it's possible. But even if that is true or not, I'm not saying it is true. I'm saying even if I granted it, it does not necessarily mean that the 12 disciples did not exist. It would merely suggest that they organized the system of 12 in relation to the zodiac, assuming there really is a connection. And that's as far as I'm willing to go. And again, that's even assuming it's true, which I am not assuming it's true. But again, the Gospels are aware of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there is scholarship on that matter. Like Dr. Bartosz Adamczewski, I've had him on the channel before, Dr. Robert Eisenman. Both of them have noted parallels with the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm not exactly sure if Eisenman thinks the Gospels are lifting directly from the Scrolls. I think he does, but Bartosz Adamczewski certainly does think this, that the Gospels are lifting from the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're copying, plagiarizing the Dead Sea Scrolls, for sure. Let me correct myself. Actually, yeah, I am certain that Eisenman thinks that as well. So I think that the 12 men in the Ebionite movement before the emergence of Christianity, they got the 12 disciple system from the scrolls. Jesus is getting his ideas, I think, from the Dead Sea Scrolls and how he sets up his movement. Not all of his ideas, but I would say a fair number of his ideas. And finally, it is time to address the claim that the crucifixion is based upon sun worship. Astrological origin theorists claim that Jesus' crucifixion was based on the death and rebirth of the sun during what is called the winter solstice. And while it is true that both Jesus and Sol Invictus share a 3-day death and resurrection in common, crucifixion is not what Sol Invictus goes through, which gets us to the main problem here, as these adherents are not addressing the fact that the crucifixion, at least I don't think they're addressing it enough, the fact that it was a common form of execution. I know Kevin earlier did actually mention this. The crucifixion being maybe not an extremely common form of execution, but it was used, and it was also used before the Roman Empire, indeed, not just by the empire exclusively. I agree with Kevin. The evidence for crucifixion from physical evidence is very small. We have one example right there of a nail going through a foot. And I think they may have found also crucifixion nails somewhere else. I'm not positive. But yeah, you can probably count in one hand, or maybe not even entirely on all 5 fingers of the hand, the physical evidence for crucifixion. But Seneca and Josephus are aware of crucifixion. I have the examples. I'm not going to read all that, but Josephus coming across 3 guys being crucified that he says were colleagues of his. Seneca the Younger, writing before Josephus, was also aware of the crucifixion. He talks about it. And Cicero talks about it too. I could go on. I'm not going to go on through a whole load of examples, but I have enough examples here to get the point across that there is evidence of awareness of the crucifixion. I would say a wide-scale awareness of the crucifixion. That takes me to my conclusion. Well, astrotheology, or the astronogenesis theory, may have influenced. Okay, let me start over. While astrotheology may have influenced the early followers of Jesus into embellishing him after his death, the astronogenesis theory for the character of Jesus fails to explain the historical aspects of Jesus and fails to address the circumstances of his death, paralleling the executions of other historical figures. Simply saying that he has 12 disciples and it parallels the 12 signs of zodiac doesn't cut it. Saying the sun reflects on water, and therefore that's where the idea of Jesus walking on water came from, doesn't work either, and so on and so forth. A lot of these things can be explained quite easily without having to dismiss that there was a historical Jesus. And I didn't even mention that when Roman emperors die, they become deified, just like the pharaohs of Egypt became deified after their deaths. Say, just like how somebody can become a saint after they die in Christianity. There's a lot of similarities there. And obviously, it's different kinds of authority. I'm not equating the authorities of them. It's obviously different. But my point is that the idea of becoming super important in a certain way after one dies is something in common across all 3 points. And when the Roman emperor dies, there's a story about he's ascending into heaven. When they see the comet going across the sky, they say, "Oh, that's him. He's ascending. There he is." Just like the ascension of Jesus in the longer ending of Mark 16:9-20, added by Aristion, the scribe working for Bishop Mark of Jerusalem, perhaps in AD 138 or 136, 138 or thereabouts. But it's definitely happening in the late AD 130s when the longer ending of Mark was created to harmonize, an attempt to expand Mark's resurrection narrative in light of Matthew, Luke, and John. So that's it. I conclude my argument.
Okay, you were about 8 minutes and 20 seconds at that point. Okay. Kevin, would you like to start? You ready to start?
Well, we're in the
this will be third.
dialogue.
Yeah, this is like round 3, basically. What do you guys want to do?
Well, I could just do a short response to the astrotheology.
Yeah, okay.
Do you want to do it 5 minutes?
Yeah, just 5 minutes is fine.
Okay, so 5 minutes for the rest of the rounds.
Okay.
Yeah. So I get that, like, Jesus is walking on water would not necessarily mean that he was not a historical person. To me, I'm waiting for the evidence of a historical person. And if the walking on water story is not included in all the Gospels, well, why is it included at all? And then and then it's not just that he walked on water and reflected the light. It's when he walked on water, and it was the third watch of the night, exactly when the sun rises in Egypt. So when the sun's literally sitting on the horizon, appearing to walk on the water, Jesus walks on the water. So you can literally picture him, the sun behind him as he's walking on the water, and the guys in the boat are staring at him, and he's standing inside the circle of the sun behind him. So it's like, okay, how much closer to the symbolism of the sun can you get than that? But so this would be third watch of the night is 6 a.m. So that's obviously when the sun would rise. And then the other point is, like this, there's the symbolism littered throughout there. Jesus insults the Pharisees for not interpreting the signs of the times. And I think he does this in Luke chapter 12 or something. And what are the signs of the times? Like, whoever's writing the New Testament must have the Old Testament as some sort of reference, in my mind. They must be getting these ideas from somewhere. And so how would you interpret what the signs of the times are at all? And to me, you might have the Old Testament sitting there. And what is the signs that God gives in Genesis? Well, that's the stars, the sun, moon, and the stars. And then when Jacob blesses his 12 sons in Israel, he blesses them with Genesis 37 and 49. Describes this blessing where the 12 signs of the zodiac basically line up. The symbolism in those chapters line up to me pretty well with the 12 signs of the zodiac. And then it's again the obsession with 12. Well, yeah, it's an obsession because it pops up everywhere. It's in the 12 stones on the high priest's breastplate, and these stones, if you think of Ezekiel, the stones, these fiery stones are the stars or the planetary rulers of the 12 signs of the zodiac. So it's literally on the high priest's breast, close to his heart is the zodiac, and this would be very important, I guess, if it's on the breastplate. And then the whole human body is symbolized in this temple, which is the high priest is symbolizing the temple. And of course, the temple is symbolized as the Noah's Ark. So you have this theme of this 12 repeating itself, the 12 nations of Israel. And of course, what do the Israelites do? They fall away, they come back. They fall away, they come back. They fall away, they come back. And to me, that's it's exactly what the zodiac does. It goes to day cycles, night cycles, day cycles, night cycles, exiles, return, exile, return. It's, to me, like if an Egyptian was interpreting this, he'd think, well, that's the constellations they're disappearing and they're returning. So if you look at it through the eyes of an Egyptian, they would see this as a sacred text, and it's telling the story of the zodiac, and they personified it.
1 minute.
And then later on, the Christians would take this amazing story, and they would basically try to find the historical elements in it, and they would miss the whole point. So that's kind of my issue with it, is we've kind of missed the point. So
Okay. Jacob.
And the point that I've been trying to make is, as Kevin noted a moment ago, yeah, of course, you got the 12 tribes in the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, or Tanakh, as it is called in Judaism. And again, the idea of setting it up in the exact way the Gospels have it seems to be more or less coming from the Dead Sea Scroll, the community rule that I was showing earlier. And I do think that the system of 12 men in authority in that way is definitely being inspired from the 12 tribes in the Hebrew Bible. There's clearly a link there. I think we could probably agree at least on that point. But still, I still must express my skepticism about linking it to the zodiac. I'm not persuaded of this. Like I said, even if I granted that they were inspired in that way because there happens to be 12 signs in the zodiac, it does not necessarily constitute that the 12 disciples didn't exist. It also doesn't mean that there were originally no 12 tribes of Israel either. But we're not debating if there were 12 tribes or not. But the 12 disciples, it's not enough to refute their historicity. And we see this obsession with zealots. And you mentioned earlier Sons of Thunder, the Bowen Regesh, John and James. They're also mentioned together briefly in the Clementine recognitions. And when you see Thomas being called the twin, again, he wasn't originally the twin. He's called that later. He's called this later. And when he is called that, I think it was done. Probably, here I could probably think it was to imitate Greco-Roman thought, with Apollo being the twin brother to Artemis, his sister. Could be, and even if that's the case, it does not mean that there was no Thomas, who I think was originally Jesus' half brother. Same mother, different father. So again, like saying and conceding that Greco-Roman thought is influencing the New Testament, that alone is also not enough to refute the historicity of Jesus and the 12 disciples. You have Simon the Zealot, that was among Jesus's followers, and you see that they're constantly meeting their end in a violent manner. This is consistent with the notion of the original Jesus movement being zealots. I think that Schweitzer and Ehrman are right in what they say. I think Dr. Schweitzer and Dr. Ehrman are right that Jesus was an apocalypticist, sure, but I also think he can be a zealot at the same time. You do not have to exclude one in favor of the other. You can favor both positions. They're not incompatible. So I do buy Dr. Risa Aslan and Dr. SGF Brandon's position that Jesus was a zealot. I like the way Dr. Eisman puts it in the conclusion to James, brother of Jesus. I don't have his exact words in front of me, but I'm going to paraphrase it. He said something to the effect of, "Who and whatever James was, so too was Jesus." And I think that's true. I think that James was a zealot, and I think that's why the original Paul tried to kill him. And one of Paul's close associates, one of his followers, finished off James after noticing he was still alive. And the James that's in Josephus, it's interesting because it creates a problem there. Eisenman tries to posit that the James mentioned in the recognitions wasn't actually killed. He survived. Now, if you look at the recognitions by itself, okay. If you look at the recognitions by itself, okay, I guess you could think he was alive. But it's improbable that he lived all the way to the 8060s to be killed by the high priest Ananas ben Ananas or Hanan ben Hanan in 8062. That's kind of strange. To me, it's kind of, no offense to Dr. Eisenman, it's kind of as ridiculous as me hearing a Christian apologist claim that. And I'll conclude by saying this one last thing here about that. Judas's death in Matthew can work with Acts, because if Judas hangs himself, because Judas commits suicide in Matthew by hanging himself, his guts explode too in Acts after he's done hanging himself. And that's just, I think we can both agree here that that's laughable. These are two contradictory deaths of Judas. They cannot be harmonized. In the same way that I do not think that the attack on James in the 30s can be harmonized with the attack on James in the 60s, although Eisman, for some reason, puts the Clementine recognitions attack in the 40s, even though that's not what the text says. I conclude there for now.
Okay. That's 3 rounds we went through. Yeah. What do you guys want to do for this fourth round? Just have a back and forth? What do you know? It's kind of up to you
Yeah,
guys.
I think we should have a conversation, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're in the conversation phase.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, like I concede that, like these things had to come from somewhere. They obviously had to come up with these 12 disciples, and why not pick somebody who is alive, and then make them famous and make them sort of astrologize them and give them some sort of salvation or divinity, and promote them in whatever church or brotherhood that you want. I don't know, maybe I'll do that one day for myself. It's like write my own gospel, right? Obviously, it was a famous thing to do. They were obviously using archetypes, and then they were using names of people. The problem is with like Jesus, his name means savior. So then is he just a symbol of a savior, or is that name just given because it's a common name? And there's a guy over here in the corner who wasn't very popular, but he wants to be popular, so we're going to put him in the story. And then it's like, to me, it's more interesting that what the symbol means, and the symbol, it means a savior. What's he saving you from? And it repeats itself as it's saving you from sin. It's not actually saving you from hell, like a lot of Christians can teach you. It's like, well, you need to repent and be saved from hell. It's like, well, you're actually being saved from your sin, but people still sin. So what's happening? Why are people still sinning? And so then, to me, sin becomes a symbol of just unrighteousness and darkness, and hell itself. So because it's all kind of connected, one leads to the other. So then, Jesus is the sunlight that saves you from the darkness of hell, and he's the savior. So why would a historical guy want to be that, unless he was like being the leader of a cult? And of course, you'd have to control a lot of information. You have to control a lot of people in order to get them to believe that you were the Jesus guy. And to me, that would it would probably be a pretty bad cult, because you'd have to control people. You'd have to stop them from reading books and understanding the symbolism. Or maybe it's somewhat positive, and as people get older, they learn the mystery and they figure out, okay, this guy over here, he just represents this savior that we're actually talking about. He's just a symbol. He's just a person, but he's just in place of he's like the Catholic Pope. He's just in place, standing and representing the true symbol, which is the savior. And to me, that's what we have in the Catholic Church, is the Pope represents Christ, and is the Christ on earth, basically, or the high priest. So then, to me, the story is more interesting in terms of meaning and applying meaning to your life than to know if there was this historical dude who farted and burped and shit his pants and stumbled on rocks, and was trying to make a name for himself by historicizing mythology. Basically, to me, that's just kind of sad to imagine. And to me, the disciples dying, that's an interesting point. With all the disciples dying brutal deaths, I think it's symbolic how they die. Like Peter's crucified upside down. Well, to me, you can turn the gospel upside down. In Acts, it talks about the world being turned upside down, and the cosmos is always turning upside down. So to me, there's something there to look into. That's exciting to me. Peter is the rock. So the rock is symbolized. It's the sacred. It's the New Jerusalem is the rock. Mount Zion is the rock. And that's very clearly symbolized because there's two different Jerusalems in Galatians. And then, so you have all this language, and it's talking about something. And to me, it's talking about the zodiac and the turning of the seasons, and the continual death and rebirth of the cosmos. And it's talking about like the purification essentially of our soul. And to me, that's the lake of fire. It doesn't even make sense that there's a literal lake of fire. And if the 12 disciples are on a mission to save you from the lake of fire, well, they're on a mission for the zodiac. So because in Egypt there was another lake of fire, and it was Ra went through the lake of fire daily on his journey through the Duat. So to me, the lake of fire isn't even a new idea. So the whole purpose of the 12 disciples is astrotheology, if they did exist. So
Yeah, I avoided getting into canonical Paul for the most part earlier because, as I mentioned, there's a problem. Like, and people are going to fight this because they're not used to hearing something like this. Yet, strangely, even non-believers are fighting this, and it's really has me puzzled. But that is that the letters of Paul were misdated. This is something that's bothered me for many years. The uncertainty of the dating of Paul's letters. I've spoken to scholars privately, won't name names, that have told me the dating of Paul is not settled. It is not settled. It is not as settled as it is portrayed by the consensus. And there is actually a lot of doubt emerging behind the scenes. And I imagine we're going to be starting to see this creep into public spaces more over the years. But you had like that strange thing I was talking about recently where Josephus mentions Jesus, James, that's supposedly Jesus' brother. And then you have John the Baptist. But there's not one reference, not anything about Paul anywhere. And there's a stranger thing too about that, Justin Martyr. Now this one's the real crazy one. You'd expect that he would mention Paul's letters, not a peep. And he's writing in the mid-2nd century. That's like, wow, that's just nuts. Justin Martyr? How could Justin Martyr not know about Paul's letters in the mid-2nd century? Now, I do think that Paul's letters are 1st century, late 1st century, but I do put it in the 1st century still. I'm not convinced that they're a 2nd century text. I had Dr. Nina Livesey on the channel, and she holds the position that the Pauline epistles originate from the Marcionite community. Although when it comes to the Marcion position, I stick to the consensus view that Marcion did abridge Luke and Paul. I'm not convinced at the moment that the Marcionite edition of the New Testament came first. And there's some people out there I don't think are appreciative enough of the fact that you have scholars. I can have one scholar on who says one completely different thing from what another scholar says. And that's what I try to do. I try to entertain different positions. I'm doing that right now too, in this very debate. And that being said, I'm gonna get right back on the subject of this debate, and that is, I think the historical Jesus, just like with a lot of other people, he was deified after he died. He experienced a mythologization after he died. When it comes to Paul and how I use Paul here, that's a more complicated story. You have different versions of Paul in his death in various sources. And that's what I noted in a few shows I did on here and on Derek's channel recently, that you've got one Clement that says one thing. You've got you got a completely different death for Paul in the Acts of Paul. And the Acts of Paul, this one, I just had to laugh the first time I read it. He gets beheaded under Emperor Nero in the 80s, 60s. And he then rises from the dead. Like did his head get reattached? Come on. But here's the thing. I want to show you this real quick. This is kind of an example of why I didn't want to, when we were spending time arguing the existence or non-existence of Jesus earlier in the debate. this is why right here I wanted to steer clear of bringing in the historical Paul too much into the debate, because of stuff like this. This is coming from Josephus. And he's telling us that Saul and his brother Costobarus were going to go see Emperor Nero in 66 AD, the start of the Jewish War. When you can see at the end of the first paragraph, they're going there to lay blame of their kindling the war upon Florus, as hoping to alleviate his own danger by provoking his indignation against Florus. Now, you see how that's kind of similar to what we see in the Acts of Paul. In the Acts of Paul, it has a centurion called Cestus, which sounds like Cestius, the Roman commander that lost his army in Josephus. And Cestus is, I think he's one of the men that witnesses Paul as being alive. He's not dead, he's alive. And then just after that, you got the mention of the people of Damascus when they were informed of the destruction of the Romans, set about the slaughter of the Jews that were among them. And you see how you put that together. It kind of looks like Paul's flight from Damascus. It's set in both 2 Corinthians, even though 2 Corinthians situates the situation 30 years earlier in time, almost 30 years earlier in time. Whereas in Acts, it puts the event in the 50s or 60s, depending how you interpret it, but it's definitely not 30s. And he's fleeing from Jews, by the way, in Acts, just like the Saul person here does. But the person called Saul here isn't really Paul, but he's being plagiarized to rewrite the historical Paul. And we see this with Jesus too, but the way the Gospels knows Josephus. Hugh Schoenfield in the Passover plot in the mid-20th century, he pointed this out. Josephus taking down 3 guys from the cross, 2 of them die and 1 survives. Hugh Schoenfield says that's similar to Joseph Arimathea asking for the body of Jesus. I actually agree with that. Yeah, I do think plagiarisms are going on in Josephus, and Jesus' life is being rewritten. When you look at the Gospel of the Hebrews, you don't see there's no evidence of a Joseph Arimathea in the Gospel of the Hebrews asking for the body of Jesus. That's why I believe that text is older, because a lot of this more developed ideas that we see in the canonical texts are not in that gospel. He just doesn't seem to know about it. And Clement, he doesn't know about it either. He doesn't know nothing about 4 gospels at all. And what he knows about Paul is extremely debatable. I would say he doesn't really know much about a Pauline corpus either. I mean, to say he knows a corpus is being generous as it is. I don't think he even knows a corpus. There's a blind man. I don't have the passage, but there's actually a blind zealot in Josephus. I think it's in the Antiquities. That's leading Jewish rebels. He gets killed. He gets martyred. And it reminded me of the blind man Jesus heals in Mark. In Mark's gospel, Jesus uses spittle, puts spittle on his eyes and heals him. Then we have another story where Jesus is healing another man. So there's 2 guys being healed in different ways by Jesus and Mark. In Pliny the Elder's Natural History, Jesus... No, sorry, not Jesus. Pliny the Elder doesn't mention Jesus. What I'm saying is Pliny the Elder mentions the idea, the method of healing somebody using spittle on their eyes, healing them of their blindness. So I think Mark's gospel probably lifted that narrative from Pliny. And that's kind of my point, how they're taking these different motifs or different ideas or even real medical treatments of the era, and they're applying it to Jesus. And I think Jesus is being made into somebody that can do these things, but better. He can imitate Greco-Roman gods, Greco-Roman characters, as Dr. Robin Faith Walsh and Dr. Dennis MacDonald point out. Oh, Jesus can calm the storm, or Odysseus can too, but Jesus does it better. And he does everything better than these other people do, and these other gods do. And I feel like, to conclude what I'm saying, I feel like the way Jesus is being mythologized after he died is kind of like, perhaps originally Jesus was being turned into this quasi-divine entity because these people were desperate. He's dead. We can't believe he's dead. He's supposed to be the Messiah. They thought he was going to bring about the new kingdom. Then again, what we see in both versions of Thomas, the original Thomas, obviously, I think is more important here. The kingdom is already here. There's no mention of Jesus coming back. It's not going to come back in the future. That's a later idea. There's no mention of a second coming. As far as Jesus is concerned, everything's fulfilled already. And in the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Christ and Jesus aren't the same entity. The Christ is possessing Jesus' body. He's possessing his body. And then it leaves him at the crucifixion. It forsook him at the cross. Whereas when you go to the Gospels, they're exactly the same thing. So the Gospels like correct that to make them the same being. And then the idea that Christ and Jesus were two distinct entities that were combined at the baptism when the Christ possessed Jesus' body, that's considered adoptionist heresy by later Christians. And if anybody wants to really look into the Gospel of Hebrews in depth, I couldn't possibly recommend Dr. James Edwards more for that in his book on the Hebrew Gospel. I've also done interviews with him on this channel. So check him out if you want to know more about the Hebrew Gospel. He's the man for that. But I think by putting it in the order of first edition of Thomas or Oxyrhynchus Thomas, which I think are fragments of the original Thomas. I didn't get into those details in the previous shows, but that's what I was talking about. The smaller Thomas. I admit there were a couple of details I did change on, but in terms of like how much I think goes back to the original, I'm a little bit more careful about that than I was earlier, I would say. And then the Hebrew Gospel, I think, follows that. And you can see, you start with a text where there's no miracles at all, not even implied. You get to the Hebrew Gospel, we're getting there. We got a resurrection and post-resurrection appearances, but there's no, other than that, there's still no miracles. Not really. Well, besides the supernatural event of Christ possessing Jesus. That's it. That's the only exception. And then you don't get Christian Gospels until the beginning of the 2nd century. And then all of a sudden you got miracles out the wazoo. One miracle after the other. So yeah, I'm just going to conclude that I think this, just to summarize what I was saying, to sum it up, that Jesus, the followers of Jesus, the Ebionites, they were in crisis because of his death, and I think his death happened in 32 AD, and Matthew, the author of the Hebrew Gospel, I think there were a couple of things that were going on when he was writing it. And I think he was writing it in 36 AD. One of the reasons I think he wrote it in 36 AD is because that's when the Clementine recognitions puts Matthew succeeding Judas. I think Judas Iscariot and Thomas were possibly originally the same person. And then, by the way, Judas Iscariot is mentioned as being replaced by Matthew in both the Hebrew Gospel and in the Clementine recognitions. And I want to note to the audience that neither text refers to Judas as a traitor. They don't know about him betraying Jesus. And he dies, and they don't tell you how he dies. Just want to throw that in here real quick. Another reason why I think those texts are older than our Gospels. They don't know about the later stories of Judas Iscariot and his betrayal of Jesus. I think Judas betraying Jesus was stolen from the book of Genesis. when Judah betrays Joseph, sells his own brother into slavery for 20 pieces of silver. Then in the Gospels, Judas betrays Jesus, and then Matthew makes it 30 pieces of silver instead of 20. I think we could probably agree on that. So I think the historical Judas got rewritten to imitate the Old Testament Judah. Because when you look at the older text, Judas isn't as similar to that character. He becomes more similar to that character in the canonical text, but not so much in the earlier text. That's another example of a historical character being rewritten to parallel somebody else, which is what I've been arguing throughout this debate happened to Jesus. I think he was rewritten several times to parallel both mythical and historical figures simultaneously. That's kind of my point. Yeah, I think I'll conclude there. I've spoken quite a while there.
All right. That's the fourth round. Anybody have anything else? You have anything else, Kevin?
Well, I just want to say a quick quote, and then I just want to mention the Clementine recognitions. But the Clementine recognitions, I wasn't familiar with it before, but I looked it up, and to me it seems symbolic too. It doesn't I didn't read as Herodotus reads, for example, and I think if you Google it, the internet will tell you these are kind of, I think he was like the stories of Peter. It's like a tale of about gospel or the disciple Peter, and to me that it sounds. I read a little bit of that, and the language is symbolic. And then, but no, I agree with the Judas. I think that's interesting about Judas being copied from Judah. Judas again, he's astrotheologically he betrays. He's the 12th sign, or you could say he betrays the year to the new year. He betrays the sun to the new year, or he betrays the Son of God to the new kingdom. And he does it with a kiss, and the kiss leaves the mark of a scorpion, and that's Scorpio, or you could say. So then the new year is right after Scorpio, coincidentally. I don't think so, but as I just wanted to quote I was mentioning at the beginning about the rationalist delusion, and I just want to point out why we have a rational delusion, and that's just a short paragraph from the book The Righteous Mind, basically by Jonathan Haidt, and this goes in line with just keeping track of your own psychology as you study different religions. And that's Western philosophy has been worshiping reason and distrusting the passions for thousands of years. There's a direct line running from Plato through Immanuel Kant to Lawrence Kohlberg. I'll refer to this worshipful attitude throughout this book as the rationalist delusion. I call it a delusion because when a group of people make something sacred, the members of the cult lose the ability to think clearly about it. Morality binds and blinds us. The true believers produce pious fantasies that do not match reality, and at some point somebody comes along to knock the idol off its pedestal. That was Hume's project, with his philosophically sacrilegious claim that reason was nothing but the servant of the passions. So that's the quote by Jonathan Haidt. So to me, that's been why I study psychology alongside studying Christianity and history. That's just a way to keep my own mind in check and make sure I'm thinking clearly about I'm approaching the text clearly, and I'm feeding my brain properly so that I can approach the text with a clear mind, and I can recognize the symbolism. And in the Masons, Freemasons probably understand this stuff better than I do because they base everything off of astrotheology. So maybe the Freemasons secretly understand the Bible this way too, and they just haven't told us yet. So, but yeah, I think it should be continued to be talked about and continue to debate it, because if there was somebody, then it helps us understand how these things develop, and helps us understand where Christianity came from, where our culture came from, and why we're here, and how we can move forward, and how basically religion applies today, and how we can keep the important values and leave behind the bad ones, so to speak. So that's why I'm doing these debates too. Is that I think it's still important to keep the gold nuggets of truth, and keep the wisdom, and kind of get rid of sort of things that we thought were true but were not so. So no, I look forward to understanding more of this the circumstantial evidence around the historicity of Christ, and I hope to debate more in the future. So that's basically how I would like to end.
All right. Jacob, any final thoughts, Jacob?
No, I think I've given mine already. And I just want to thank Kevin for participating in the second debate.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks a lot.
And I want to thank everybody else for watching.
Definitely.
And thank you, Sean, for moderating.
Oh, anytime, man. Anytime.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Oh, yeah.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.